So you may ask yourself, why are we hearing this and why are we hearing it now? So three things. The first is, and Chair Gore, you mentioned the Race Equity Inclusion Working Group that's going to get reconvened this year. This really is a follow-on in some ways to our racial equity framework, the work that the staff and the REI working group did last year to explicitly delve into really important regional topics with a racial equity lens. And I can't think of a better, more timely one right now than housing. Second, we have, as SACOG and all of you as local governments, a natural legal responsibility to affirmatively further fair housing. I know that's a mouthful, but it is in state statute. We have to do everything we can to reduce barriers and encourage more housing and multifamily housing and housing that's accessible to all, especially in high opportunity areas. And Dov Caden touched on that. So we have a state mandate and requirement to actually look at not just housing in general, but affirmatively furthering fair housing. We did that through our RENA, and now third point about why you're hearing this now, because we're on the tail end of the RENA cycle, the Regional Housing Needs Allocation, trying not to use too many acronyms. And all of your jurisdictions this year will be adopting and updating your housing elements. So it really is incredibly timely. And I know, Chair Gore, you've put a big emphasis on housing this year. And we really appreciated that. So I'm excited to be introducing our speaker for the workshop, Dr. Stephen Menendian. Stephen's the policy director at the UC Berkeley Othering and Belonging Institute. Stephen's primary areas of expertise are structural racism, fair housing, and civil rights law. And Stephen's presentation today is going to be focused on the intersection of current housing policy and racial inequality, including some of his recent research on contemporary racial segregation in the Bay Area. And I know we always try to have examples from either around the state of California or other metro regions that are like ours. Stephen's research is in the 9-county Bay Area. He's gone deep in the Bay Area. And so just so you all understand, I think there's a lot that he is going to share with his research that's focused, and a lot that we can learn, I think, in this region too. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Stephen Menendian.
Thank you so much, James. I appreciate the introduction, and it's an honor and a pleasure to be here. A couple of preliminary notes. First, forgive me for wearing a visor and informality. I'm covering up for the fact that I haven't been to a barber in a year, and that I've been cutting my own hair. Also, when Dov approached me about presenting in front of you, he asked if I could talk about the relationship between land use and zoning, between zoning and race, zoning and class, land use policy and affirmatively furthering fair housing, AFFH, and RENA, the relationship between past discrimination and present day effects, and more. And I said, okay, we have 3 hours or 3 days. He said, no, you have 30 minutes. Okay, well, let's see what we can do. So James and Dov and I got on a call, and we kind of narrowed down the focus of this to try and focus on present day effects. But then last night, I listened to the recording that Dov sent me of one of your previous meetings, and realized that there was even more that I needed to try and address. So let me open up the slide deck. Yeah, the conversation that you had, I think, last time was really important, but also I think kind of pushed me in some slightly different directions. So that, okay, thank you. I see that it's up. We'll proceed to the first full slide. So just very quickly, I just want to get on the same page on what we're talking about. We're talking about zoning and land use. I'm not going to define zoning for you. You all know what zoning is and how it's, but the one thing I just want to emphasize is that zoning is only one form of land use regulation. There are over 30,000 municipalities, townships, and other municipal or local government entities in the United States that have land use authority. But what I do want to do is suggest a set of heuristics for thinking about zoning. You know, zoning is when I speak with reporters, what I realize is that there are certain terms that have acquired kind of cultural currency that are used not in a particular or specific way, but that are used in a general, as almost a synecdoche to stand in for a certain set of things. So for example, redlining. Redlining is a very particular practice, but it has now become a sort of a stand-in for all exclusionary and racialized land use policies. And so what I want to do when I talk about zoning is I want to talk about 3 different types of zoning. If you could click. So the first type of zoning, just quickly, is what's known as racial zoning. And this was the first form of zoning that emerged in the first decade of the 20th century. And this zoning was first enacted, well, there were different forms of it. One form actually emerged in the Bay Area that sort of restricted where, for example, Chinese laundries could operate. But the first residential form of this emerged in Baltimore, I think around 1910. And what it did was it specifically said that people of a certain race could only live in certain demarcated neighborhoods. This form of zoning was struck down by the United States Supreme Court in 1917 in a case called Buchanan versus Worley. The most prominent form of zoning that emerged in the progressive era was called use zoning. And use zoning is simply the idea that you separate certain forms of uses within a municipal area or a metropolitan region. And the most kind of, I think, well-known example of this is separating, for example, industrial uses from residential uses. And use zoning became a municipal tool that was popularized as a replacement for nuisance law. So instead of relying, so for example, if you have an apartment building, let's say in Boston, in Jamestown, in Charlestown, rather, and there is a smokestack next door to it that's belching soot into the apartment, you could sue for nuisance as a private nuisance, but it would be difficult to bring a claim and costly and time intensive, and it doesn't solve the immediate problem. So municipalities began using use zoning, especially since a lot of factories in the industrial Midwest and Northeast were built into the heart of metropolitan areas. Use zoning was a way to try and it was a proactive, prophylactic way of separating these kinds of uses. And so industrial uses, residential uses, commercial uses began separated through use zoning. And this form of zoning was upheld in a very famous case out of the Supreme Court in the 1930s called Euclid, not named after the ancient Greek mathematician, but rather named after a suburb out of Cincinnati. So it's called Euclidean zoning. But what I want to draw your attention to is a third type of zoning, and these are these are heuristics, these are my terms, is what I call fiscal zoning. These are not technical terms that you'll find in the urban studies literature per se. These are just, again, broad ways of describing these types of zoning. Fiscal zoning really emerges in the 1960s and accelerates in the 1970s and 80s. And the difference between use zoning and fiscal zoning is that whereas use zoning is really focused on separating certain kinds of uses, fiscal zoning becomes a mechanism for controlling development, and specifically certain types of development that either increase the risk of outlays, so public expense, or minimize those kinds of, or rather maximize revenue. So for example, if a city is considering a certain kind of development, they might look at what sort of tax revenue, property tax revenue, or other forms of revenue, parcel taxes and so on, would be generated by that development. Or alternatively, what sort of costs would entail. For example, what sort of demands would be put on local infrastructure in terms of water, sewer hookup, electricity. Frankly, one of the larger costs of development, especially for families, is education, right? And so if you have a large development where you anticipate there will be a lot of children, then you have to anticipate, well, are we gonna have to build a new school? Are we gonna have to expand our existing school? Are we gonna have to hire teachers? I see a lot of you nodding, so this is familiar. So fiscal zoning is the use of zoning to control development. And in particular, not just development, but to minimize fiscal costs and maximize revenues. And so what the problem that fiscal zoning has created is that fiscal zoning incentivizes developments that produce the most revenue and minimize those that entail the most municipal costs. So I just wanted to go over that use zoning has kind of evolved into fiscal zoning. And what happens is that cities compete against each other for residents, right? They're trying to do two things. They're trying to create economic activity, right, to lure businesses into, and at the macro scale, it looks like the Amazon HQ2 competition, right, where cities actually put in these formal proposals. In a micro level, though, they're just trying to keep local businesses, spur local business, but also they're trying to, frankly, lure the wealthiest, most affluent, and most capable citizens that will pay, you know, at the lowest effective tax rate, the highest local taxes, and contribute to the community, and also, frankly, keep out people who will put on more demands on public services. So let's move on. So zoning and land use regulation are assumed to have effects, otherwise would it be so ubiquitous? But it's kind of remarkable that when you actually look at the research studying the effects of zoning, there is very little empirical systematic research. So if you were to ask yourself, what is the actual research demonstrate in terms of the effects of zoning, you can find very little. And there's a fundamental problem, which is there is just a lack of data. And the reason there is a lack of data, underlying data to analyze, is because, number one, there is no single comprehensive database or repository of zoning in the United States. It does not exist. Why is that? Well, partly because of the second reason here. There is no universal standard for zoning classifications or base zoning formula from which such data may be derived. What does that mean? It's academic speak here, but what it basically means is that across the United States, cities enact their own idiosyncratic and unique both zoning ordinances as well as design their own shapefiles. So you essentially have to go into each municipal ordinance, study it, to understand what it's saying. There are, of course, similarities. So, R1 is often, single family zoning of a certain lot size across the United States. But the truth is that once you dig into the details, every municipality does it its own way. So because there are over 30,000 municipalities that have their own idiosyncratic land use ordinances, and zoning shapefiles and so on, you have to study each one individually. And so there's just no database or index by which to compare it in a systematic way. Keep going. So where do you get data on zoning? Well, I'll mention there are a number of surveys that were begun in the late 1970s and early 1980s to study this issue, especially as fiscal zoning proliferated. I'll mention a few of these from the that were undertaken in the 21st century. The first is this Brookings survey. It was a survey of 1,800 jurisdictions in the 50 largest metros. Now, they actually surveyed double that number. 1,800 were the actual number of jurisdictions that responded to the survey. The most famous survey instrument and database of zoning is the Wharton Residential Land Use Regulatory Index, which was conducted in 2000. Well, it was compiled in 2006. It was conducted over the preceding years. It was over 2,600 jurisdictions. I'm going to say a little bit more about this index later, but it's the most widely used in the empirical research and the economic and sociological research. More recently, the Urban Institute conducted another large survey of 1,700 jurisdictions. And then here in California, the most important is the Turner Center survey of the Residential Land Use Survey conducted in 2017 and 2018. And they surveyed almost 600 jurisdictions. There were 252 that actually replied. That is probably the best, most California-specific data point. Let's keep going. So based upon these studies, here are some of the main findings. The first is Jonathan Rothwell, who is an economist at Gallup. He's a phenomenal economist. He found that using the Turner survey, the Turner Center survey, Turner Center is an institute at UC Berkeley, that California cities with more restrictive zoning are more racially segregated. Specifically, he found that areas, meaning neighborhoods or municipalities with restrictive zoning, have more white residents and fewer Black and Latinx residents. So again, this is not the Bay Area specific, this is California-wide. He found that citizen opposition to development also predicts the exclusion of Black and Hispanic residents. And he found in Los Angeles, just to take one example in his report, rents are 32% higher and home values almost 40% higher in jurisdictions with the most stringent lot size requirements, meaning the largest lot sizes, the most specific forms of, for example, setbacks, parking requirements, and so on, compared to jurisdictions that are more relatively lenient. Keep going. Jenny Schutz and her colleague Murray at the Urban Institute did a study with the Urban Survey and found similarly that cities nationwide with more restrictive zoning have fewer apartments, and that compared to other states, the state of California produces very little multifamily housing because we have more restrictive zoning and land use policies. Keep going. Jessica Trunstein, who is a political scientist and a very well-regarded one at University California, Merced, used the 2006 Wharton Regulatory Land Use Index to conduct a study which she reported in, I forget the journal, in January of 2020. And she found, similarly, that cities that were whiter in 1970, around the time that the Fair Housing Act, the National Federal Fair Housing Act took effect, have more restrictive land use policies in 2006. And she found that cities with more restrictive land use policy were whiter than their metropolitan areas in 2011, even after controlling for their racial demographics in 1970. So what that suggests is that the more restrictive land use policies that were enacted after the Fair Housing Act actually continue to maintain that racial exclusivity, even in the face of the Fair Housing Act, and even controlling for their initial demographics in 1970. She found that cities that were forced, that confronted fair housing suits or were forced to liberalize, have slightly less residential segregation and also slightly, therefore, slightly less restrictive land use policy. And she found that white residents tend to be more supportive of restricted land use policy than non-white residents, using, again, the national survey. Keep going. So this is, it's important to point out that the research I've just described is basically the extent of the research that exists on the effects of land use policy. And again, I presented the data sources. The problems with this research are that, number one, the underlying data is all survey-based. And a close inspection of the survey results show that there are systematic flaws in the research. Now, the critics of the research will say there are systematic flaws in just errors, but the research suggests that actually the surveys underestimate the restrictiveness of land use that was studied. So for example, the Turner survey asks broad categorical questions of the city planners or city planning departments that were responded to the survey. So for example, it asks questions like, what percentage of residential land or land in your city is single family zoning? 0 to 25%, 25 to 50%, 50 to 75%, 75% to 100%, right? So broad categorical answers. Or for example, how long does it take start to finish from an approval to actual built development? 0 to 1 year, 1 to 2 years, 2 to 3 years, and so on. And what the research shows is that the survey respondents to the Turner survey, after looking at a handful of cities to ground truth this, that the survey respondents in these planning departments or in these cities systematically underestimated approval timelines, public opposition to development, and the percentage or degree of restrictive zoning in their own jurisdiction. Underestimated. And also, as I said before, the survey responses were incomplete, right? 52% response rate to the Turner survey, which I think is actually a good high response rate, but it's just it's not complete. It's not comprehensive. All right, let's keep going. So I wanted you to understand that data to understand what we did. What we did in the Bay Area and what we are going to do for the state of California is we are pulling every municipal zoning ordinance directly. We are reaching out to the cities and we are downloading the shapefiles and actually studying satellite data and planned development areas to identify actual zoning and built environment we did this for 101 municipalities in the Bay Area. Keep going. I'm just going to skip over this. Keep going. And we actually published the results. You can go back up one slide. We publish static maps of every city in the Bay Area on our website here. And then we also, next slide, we actually create an interactive map, a dynamic map where you can click, you can zoom to the city and you can see actually the zoning that we've studied. Now, we only looked at 3 basic zoning categories rather than the plethora of zoning that actually exists. Go to the next screen. We looked at 3 things. We looked at non-residential zoning, we looked at single-family residential, and then other residential. I don't know if you can see the bottom of this slide. The bottom is covered up for me. Let me see if I can get that to show up. Barely. So what we did for every city is we calculated the percentage of single-family zoning that in each residential area. And as I said, we haven't done this for the Sacramento region yet, but we are going to do it for the rest of the state. And what we found at the level of the Bay Area region, the 9-county region, which includes Napa, Sonoma, Contra Costa, not just Alameda or San Francisco or Santa Clara counties, is that 85% of the residential land in the San Francisco Bay Area, the 9-county Bay Area, is exclusively reserved for single-family zoning. In other words, only 15% of residential land permits by zoning ordinance denser multifamily housing options. That doesn't mean that there weren't variances or mixed use areas where residential homes have been built, but according to the zoning ordinances alone, only 15% of the land permits multifamily housing, which is clearly a significant problem for a region that's the vanguard of the American economy, and which many people are trying to move to find work and jobs. Not to mention for the residents who live in these areas, right, who can't afford homes. And so I just have one example here. This is Concord, which is a suburb in Contra Costa County. And we did this again for every city in the Bay Area. Next screen. So this is the Bay Area zoning map. It's on our website that shows the 85% single family zoning in the entire region. Keep going. Now, it's not just that there is a enormous percentage of single family zoning, that we actually were able to run statistical analyses of this pattern and then study the presumed effects, or at least the correlates. But this, before I show you some of that, this is a table that shows all the cities, well, a large number of the cities in the Bay Area and how they fall in terms of the percentage of single family zoning that they have. With a range of 40 to 75%, 75 to 90%, 90 to 100%. And my guess is that if we were to study the cities in your area, they would probably be distributed in your region roughly the same across these categories. The more kind of urbanized, large urban cities fall into the left-hand column of the table, and the inner ring suburbs like Berkeley as well. But probably there would be fewer in the far left column and more in the center and right column if we were to do this for the Sacramento region. Next slide, please. So what are some of the correlations we found? We found, this was the slide, the infographic, or chart rather, that the line graph that we created that got the most attention by on social media and in just media in general, the journalists were interested in. What we found, again, this is not a sample because we studied every city in the Bay Area, that as you increase the percentage of single family zoning in a neighborhood or in a city, it essentially becomes entirely white and Asian. And as you increase that percentage, so you can see in the far right-hand side of this line graph that as you get to approach 100% single family zoning, the percentage of African American and Latinx, which are the purple and dark gray lines, go to 0. And the percentage white, I hope that you all can see the legend for this slide. In my use of Zoom, the bottom great is covered up by the taskbar. It becomes basically all white and Asian. And so what this is really demonstrating is that, yes, single family zoning has a clear racial effect, imputed effect, certainly a strong racial correlation. Keep going. So what are our main findings? I don't have time to get into all of them, but we found that cities with the highest level of single family zoning have greater resources, even relative to the generally wealthy and expensive Bay Area, in virtually every statistic we were able to measure. So you can find this in part 5 and the other single family zoning report in our series on segregation in the Bay Area. We found that these cities have higher incomes, per capita income, they have higher home values, they have better performing schools in terms of test scores using national and state level test metrics. We also compared it with the Opportunity Atlas that was created by Ross Chetty, which I'm going to talk a little bit about in a minute. And children who were raised in those cities 30 years ago have better income outcomes as adults as measured by income. But we also found a very troubling pattern of social, economic, and racial exclusion in cities with high levels of single family zoning. Keep going. So this is a bit technical, but remember the table I showed you earlier that categorizes cities into the 3 columns, 40 to 75% single family zoning. That's replicated here, but here we actually have the percentage by race for each of those categories. So you can see, for example, that as you increase the percentage of single family zoning, the percentage white goes up in the Bay Area. And by the way, white in the Bay Area is only 40% of the population. So the Bay Area is not like a 50 to 60% white region. It's a 40% white region. But in the cities that have 90 to 100% single family zoning, the overall average is 53% white. But the most important thing I wanted to point out here is the relationship between racial segregation and zoning. So we use a measure of racial segregation called the divergence index. Now, I don't have time to get into the nuances of divergence versus other measures of segregation, but divergence is, we think, the best measure of segregation because it allows you to measure segregation holistically, looking at multiple racial groups simultaneously. And what we clearly found here is that both overall aggregate racial divergence scores go up. It's the second row in the table, divergence from the Bay Area. Anything over about 0.12 divergence score is considered highly segregated. So what it means is that once you get to 75% single family zoning in an area, segregation becomes high, and it's moderate to high. And then within city segregation is a different measure of divergence, but basically it becomes the divergence score actually goes down, which means it's the segregation of people between neighborhoods in a city once you get to 100% single family zoning. And the reason is because cities are racially homogeneous, they're homogeneous once you get to a high level of single family zoning. So the neighborhoods become, for example, all white or all white and Asian. So our research shows systematically that there is a strong relationship between racial, not just economic segregation, but racial segregation and zoning. So I know this is taking a little bit longer. Let me explain why this is, if we can move forward. Geez, I don't really think I have time to go through this slide, so let me just keep going. Keep going. I'm not going to go. I was going to do a slight presentation on structural racism here, but I don't have time to get into this. So keep going. Keep going. Okay, stop here. Sorry, if you could go back.
Can I interrupt you for just 1 second? Lynette or James, do we actually have time for him to do the complete presentation? Because this is particularly interesting to me, at least, and I'd hate to have it sort of shortchanged if we have available time.
I certainly think we could definitely provide at least another 15 minutes because we're going to want to do Q&A. So
okay.
We have cleared this agenda to be able to have the time. So
Okay.
Stephen, I think,
let's back up then a couple of slides.
I think the economic, I didn't quite read the whole slide, but the economic piece of this, the mobility piece, economic mobility, I think is of great interest.
Yes. Okay, let's go back. Go back a little bit more. Okay, stop here. So I mentioned Ross Chetty's research. Ross Chetty is an economist who was at Harvard, then Stanford, back at Harvard. who has basically done one of the most innovative research studies in economics in the last 10 years. And it's not so much that he's brilliant, although he is, but he actually secured an agreement with the IRS to get tax records from every American to study their income changes over the life cycle. So he has a data set that includes every American born between, I believe, 1980 and 1986. And what he does is he studies the parent income of the children born between 1980 and 1986. And then he studies their income both in absolute terms and in percentile terms as adults. Okay, I hope you're with me so far. So this data set includes, I think it's around 40 million Americans. So to establish or explain this research, what he does is he divides in either percentile terms, he divides income into percentiles or quintiles. So percentiles, obviously a single percent within the income distribution. A simpler way of thinking about it is in terms of quintiles. So let me explain this premise. If in the United States, opportunity were equal, I just got a notification to install the latest Windows updates. Let me snooze this. If opportunity were equal, children born anywhere in the income distribution would have an equal chance of landing anywhere as adults, right? So for example, if we just think of the income distribution in terms of quintiles, first quintile down to the fifth quintile, or first to fifth. If you were born in the top 20%, you should have, if opportunity were truly equal, you should have an equal chance of landing in the top as in the bottom as an adult. Unfortunately, as you may surmise, that's not the case in the United States. What actually happens is that children born in the bottom income quintile, only 7.5% of those children actually make it to the top instead of that 20%, which is less than 5 times the chance of those born in the top, which means that if you're born in the top income quintile, you have about a 40% chance of staying there as an adult, right? Because you go to good schools, your parents probably had the income or wealth to help you matriculate into a college or university, which creates human capital and education that will allow you to get an occupation or career that has a higher level of income, and so on. Okay, so we are actually able to study this now using population level data. So next slide. What the race data shows is that this is phenomenally important to understanding structural racism in the United States. I think it's most important disparity, but I'll show you the disparities in almost every other aspect of life. If you are born into the bottom income quintile as a child, the bottom 20% of income earners, your chances of staying there as an adult, if you are Black, is 51%. Your chances of making it to the top are 3%. Now, remember I said the average in the United States is 7.5%. The American dream, right? Being born into poverty or the bottom 20% and making it to the top is 7.5% nationally. If you're Black, it's only 3%. Now look at the chart on the right. This is for whites. If you're born into the bottom income quintile, your chance of staying there is 23%, and your chance of making it to the top is 16%. This is basically, for white Americans, the American dream. This is equal opportunity. Remember how I said, if opportunity were equal, no matter where you are born in the income distribution, your chances of landing somewhere else should be about 20%. For white Americans, this is true. Landing somewhere else should be Americans. I'm hearing myself. I got a little bit of feedback for a second. So this is basically the American dream exists for white Americans, but for Black Americans, it clearly does not. Now, why might this be the case? And I have a slide on other racial disparities later, but let me explain why this occurs. Next slide. Next slide. The main reason is because of place. Place actually turns out to be, if you could go back one slide. place actually turns out to be, using the Chetty data set, the key determinant of where people end up in the income distribution as an adult. And we can, the Chetty data actually allows us to disaggregate the place-based research, because again, he's looking at, place has a causal effect. So he's able to look at where people grow up and what percentage of time they spent there as children. And so, for example, he's able to see that when kids move to a different place, what effect does that place effect have? And he's able to make a causal inference because of this reason. He's able to look at sibling pairs in families. So, for example, if you move from one...
Thanks.
Pamela, I think I can hear you. Oh, there you go. You were on. When you see siblings move from one city to another, and let's say one child is 4 and the other is 13, you're able to observe the difference effects as adults, which means that you can draw causal inferences about the place. And the main thing that we have found is that certain places have different levels of of overall upward and economic mobility. So keep going. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in a moment, what the place effect is. But basically, there are 3 geographic levels that shape upward mobility. The first is the local jurisdiction, the second is the neighborhood, and the third is the metropolitan region. The Chetty data actually allows us to assign a percentage effect to each of these geographic levels. So just thinking about it through an example, suppose you grew up in the Detroit region. The Detroit region in the 1950s was an economically booming region. By the 1990s, is in immense economic decline, right? But you might live in an affluent white suburb that still has economic vitality in the Detroit region, and you might live in a strong neighborhood with great schools in that region. So these are nested geographies that shape your life outcome. Next slide. So I've put in the percentage effects of each of these categories using the Chetty data. The Chetty data finds that the local municipal jurisdiction you live in has a 28% chance in terms of the variation in upward, explains 28% of the variation in upward mobility. The neighborhood explains 27%, and the region explains 32%. So if you live in a region that has strong economic, activity in a high quality municipality with great schools, great health and safety programs, and a neighborhood that has, all the amenities that you want, your chances of having upward mobility, a good outcome as an adult, are very good. Even if you live in a single parent home in a high, where your parents earn below the poverty line. So this is controlling for all the other factors, including family configuration, income, education of the parents. That these other forces overwhelm these fixed personal characteristics and malleable personal characteristics. They account for this percentage of upward mobility. Keep going. So why is place so powerful, and why does it have a race effect, not just an income effect? Well, this is a famous redlining map, which Dove described in the last meeting. Keep going. Past redlining and other land use policies and other governmental policies have produced racial residential segregation. I don't have time to describe this map in too much detail, but we created segregation maps for the entire Bay Area. The darker census tracts here are census tracts that have the highest levels of segregation for Alameda County. And we created one of these for all 9 counties in the Bay Area. The fundamental problem that upward mobility, the reason upward mobility is much lower by race is because racial residential segregation is greater than economic segregation in the United States. I'm going to repeat that. Racial residential segregation is greater than economic segregation. In the last meeting, or the meeting that I listened to, there was a brief discussion about, is this just economic, right? That people who can afford to live in certain neighborhoods and certain cities, are able to move into those cities, and those cities have better schools, and so on and so forth. It's not that simple, because lower income whites and middle income whites actually find their way into higher opportunity communities, whereas upper income and middle income African Americans live in lower opportunity communities. So racial residential segregation is actually the primary mechanism that causes structural racism, these racist effects. And the reason is because racial residential segregation is stronger than economic segregation. Now, if you talk to a sociologist, they might say, well, in the last 40 years, residential segregation has declined and economic segregation has increased. Depending on the measure, that is a true statement. But what that statement overlooks is that even if economic segregation and economic stratification is increasing, racial residential segregation is still at an overall aggregate higher level than economic segregation in the United States. To put it simply, the United States and California are and remain deeply racially segregated. And there are lots of reasons for this. I don't have time to get into all of them, but part of them is the effects of the past. That government policy that segregated people by race continues to persist into the present. And in fact, keep going, I'm going to show you, we found that in the 9-county Bay Area, 7 of the 9 counties have more segregation in 2010 than in 1970. So it's not, they are more segregated in 2010 than 1970. And again, 1968 is when the Federal Fair Housing Act was enacted and it went into effect in 1970. Keep going. This is a chart that shows the 9-county Bay Area. And what I want to just draw your attention to are these lines at the bottom. Some of the cities, some of the counties like Napa County, have quintupled their level of segregation. So the rural, wider counties actually have the largest increases in segregation. So I share that because the counties that probably most resemble the counties in your area, I'm speculating here, but I suspect that if I were to study the counties in your area, we would find mostly increases in segregation in that 40-year period. And once we get the 2020 census, we'll be able to extrapolate this to the present. But contrary to the narrative that racial segregation has decreased, actually that's not the case. As I said, 7 of the 9 counties have an increase in segregation. You can see both the data and the line chart here that demonstrates that. Which means that structural racism, not declining, is actually becoming more intense as we come into the future, because our regions are sorting people on the basis of class and race into higher and lower opportunity communities, neighborhoods, and regions. I'm almost done. Keep going. So I probably should have showed this earlier, but racial disparities are visible basically along any dimension of well-being: education, employment, health, income, wealth, incarceration. And so these are the effects of not just income outcomes, but these are the effects of structural, what sometimes people call systemic racism. But the cause of it is the location where people grow up and live, and all the associated effects, the resources that exist in those communities, the peer relationships, the social capital, the human capital, and much more. So I'm gonna stop there. These are just disparities that exist between white and black Americans along all of the key indicators of well-being. But I think the most important was the data on upward mobility. And there's also data on downward mobility, which I didn't include, and much more data besides. Keep going. Is that it? Is that the end? Okay. We finally hit the end. So thank you so much for your patience. I hope this was clear. I'm happy to try and answer any questions you may have. I realize that's a lot of content in a very short amount of time. Ideally, I would have had 3 days or 3 months in a course to deconstruct this, but I hope that's what you were looking to hear.
We appreciate it. Thank you so much, Stephen. I know there are questions, so if somebody's got a question, you can put the question, raise your hand. Certainly has gotten us thinking, and especially as we think about housing and moving forward, meeting our arena numbers and knowing that we have housing needs, it really gets us to the question of then how do we make changes to allow for more opportunity for people to have access to home ownership, et cetera. But you might think about that question, and I'm going to take David Sanders' question first. So Director Sanders, if you want to ask your question.
Yeah, it's going to be hard to ask just one. I do want to thank the speaker, though, for sort of confirming in the minds of many how much government planning has sort of wrecked our cities and our development patterns. That's half joke, half serious. But you know, I saw in your early data there, you were looking at a 15% multifamily as sort of a Bay Area average. And I'm curious as to what's the goal. And my primary concern about that data was accounting for density. You know, if you look at single family homes, that can be one house on a 2-acre lot zoned that way, or it can be 15 houses on an acre. So, I mean, that's a factor of 30 in density. Forcing it down to single family home versus multifamily, I'm not sure that that actually yields what you're looking for there. In addition, I would be worried about the actual value of the unit. It seems like there's a lot more factors to consider than just that really crude measurement of what percent is multifamily versus residential.
Honestly, I'm not sure where to begin to answer that sort of ball of questions. I guess I'll start with this. So we all know that there are different there is a housing crisis, right? But I think depending on who you're speaking with, there's a different definition of what that crisis is. So when I was doing I've done just an inordinate number of talks on Zoom in the last 12 months. But when I did the talk that I had mentioned before for the Florida Realtors Association, I identified 5 different housing crises. The most obvious housing crisis is just the lack of affordable housing in our regions. And that came up in the last meeting that I heard. You know, someone described a development that they were involved in and how none of that housing is going to be affordable, even though it's a little bit more dense. The second housing crisis is just a lack of production overall. So at all income levels, and RENA implicates that. A third housing crisis is displacement and gentrification. A fourth housing crisis, if you're concerned about it, is climate. And a fifth housing crisis, I think from my perspective, the most important, is the persistence of racial residential segregation. So what I say is that depending on how you define the crisis and what your goal is will shape what your policy response is. Which of those crises, if any, are you focused on? David, you didn't specifically articulate which of those crises you're focused on, but I could infer maybe you're trying to figure out how can we make more affordable housing. Well, if you're trying to build affordable housing and you're not trying to solve these other problems, then you can identify a set of policies that can help advance that goal, right? That can help you meet that objective, but they won't necessarily help you solve these other problems, right? So for example, if you're just focused on affordable housing, then you could implement a set of policies, for example, create more state subsidies for affordable housing, right? And then plan for affordable housing. But just having more affordable housing at a certain income level is not actually going to help you solve the overall production crisis, nor is it going to necessarily lead to integration or reduce displacement and gentrification. In fact, it could exacerbate displacement and gentrification because you might be redeveloping land that is currently, allocated for affordable housing. So these problems are incredibly complex. There's no silver bullet, but I think the answer to the simple question of what do we do depends on what your goal is, and you need to have clarity on the goal. Now, the other thing you raised was about how our study just looked at zoning and single-family zoning and the relationship between price and so on. Yes, our study just looked at zoning, and we found that only 15% of residential land is zoned to permit, by the zoning ordinance, denser multifamily housing options. So what do I want to say here? What I want to say is that density by itself does not mean affordability, right? And I think that example came up again in the example of your last call. I'm sorry, you asked so many different questions. Why don't I just stop and give you a chance to take another bite of the apple, and I'll try and more clearly answer the questions you had.
That's okay. I think I'll move on from there. The correlation causation issues here are significant. You referenced some of those. I'm a scientist, so that it's a
For sure.
particular interest to me. And,
So-
the interchangeability of wealth and race in a lot of the analysis, I think is hard for a lot of people on this call to get. And I should say most of us in this particular meeting were not present at the previous discussion.
Okay.
So this is a first time exposure for the majority of people on this call to what you're talking about.
Yes.
But if you could say a little more with regard to that, because what people are
Sure.
going to say is, we don't really see in our community that we're being discriminatory in some way and holding people back from economic opportunity. People have the option to, live wherever they want, wherever they can afford. And then wealth becomes
Yes.
the main determinant, not race.
So there's a lot to say there, but as a general baseline matter, there is a racial wealth gap in the United States, and it's about 13 or 12 to 1, meaning that white families have about 12 to 13 times as much wealth on average as Black families. And as Dov described at the last meeting, part of the reason for that is that federal policy and local policies and state policies in the post-war era restricted where African Americans could live and therefore accumulate wealth through home ownership. Both it restricted their ability to own homes, and the post-war boom, African Americans in downtown Detroit, a home in downtown Detroit, gained much less home value. In fact, you could buy or sell a home for like $15,000 in Detroit even today, compared to the suburbs of Detroit, and that's true basically across the United States. In terms of the correlation versus causation issue, I did try to articulate where we were running statistical correlation versus where we actually were able to identify a causality. And the Chetty study used a number of controls, including sibling pairs, to study the causal effects of place. So that is clearly established. The study we conducted, it's true, it's only correlates, but there are two additional factors that suggest that there is an underlying causal pattern. The first is that all of the research, all of the studies that have looked at this point in the same direction, right? That's why I presented the Rothwell study, the Schutz study, the Trunstein study, and then our research. The fact that there's a systematic systematic set of findings, empirical findings in the same direction, suggests that there is an underlying causal relationship. Of course, there could be some other cause. I would suggest that you're right in surmising that it probably is the racial wealth gap, but the racial wealth gap is exacerbated by some of these policies. In terms of the question of going back to the question of intent versus effects, what I call structural racism is not caused by racist actors. Rather, it's caused by institutional arrangements that, when overlaid on historical policies, continue to perpetuate racialized outcomes. And so that's why I set up the conversation by distinguishing between racial zoning, use zoning, and fiscal zoning. When cities engage in fiscal zoning, where they, for example, require a minimum lot size of 1.5 acres and low density, they're engaging in fiscal zoning, right? And there may be reasons they're doing that, but the underlying, what we have found in our research is that basically residents of American regions want several things. They want high quality home, they want large homes and great homes in high quality communities and neighborhoods that have great schools with the lowest effective tax rates. And what cities want is they want to be able to balance their budgets, right? And especially in a period of fiscal distress for the state. Now, the state's fiscal situation appears to have dramatically been revised. Last July, there was a $54 billion California state budget deficit projected, which is just, terrifying when we think about what that could mean for cities and localities. But it's clear that cities have strong incentives to try and maximize economic activity and to lure more affluent and wealthy residents, because number one, they can draw residents that will provide the most tax-based revenue and tax-based capacity, and number two, minimize outlays and demands on the city's treasury. So that competition, that municipal competition, results in zoning that is more restrictive and more exclusionary. It's not necessarily exclusionary in terms of intent, but it's clearly exclusionary in terms of effects. And the data that the systematic analysis that we conducted in the Bay Area shows that to be the case. that the communities that have the highest percentage of single family zoning have the lowest percentage of Black and Latinx residents, and so on and so forth. So it's not intent, but it's clearly the effect. And these kind of fiscal imperatives that municipalities engage in continue to produce exclusionary effects. And we can debate, the causal mechanisms underlying the outcomes, but the policy effects, I think, are pretty clear.
Thank you. Let's go ahead and take a few more questions. Director Kozlowski.
I'd actually like to let Michael Saragosa go before me, because a lot of my question has been answered, but I'd like to circle back after he asks his.
Thank you. It's more of a comment, I think, and we kind of had this in the Policy and Innovation Committee when we had sort of the pre-look at this. And that, for me, when I look at, because I wanted to dial this back down to what our goals are, and that is affordability of housing in our region, and how race and equity play into that. But, one of the concerns that I have is that when we talk about affordability and we talk about density, we start talking about apartments and rental housing, and you don't build generational wealth on that. And when you talk about the racial disparities, a lot of that goes back to home ownership and the ability for people to transfer property from generation to generation, and that ability to create that wealth, so that you start to see that income disparity between ethnicities. I have a problem as Latino, and again, I hate the term Latinx. I know it's used in academia as well as in corporate. I have clients that use it, but don't use it at all, just as a stand aside. I think it's an Anglicization of the language. Anyhow, as a side, I do think that as we look at affordability, we do need to look at that ownership angle of it, because if we want to get to the point we're going to start erasing those disparities, you got to get people into where they can afford to buy a house. If they're paying $2,000 a month for rent, we're getting somebody into housing, but is it truly affordable? And is it going to allow that next generation to build that wealth transfer? So I'm interested to hear anything along those lines, because I think that's, to me, the heart of it, where we start getting Latinos and we start getting African Americans into that home ownership, and that gap can come down. So
I want to just stipulate that I agree with basically everything you said, including I dislike the term Latinx as well. But so there is a but. I agree with everything you said. It's absolutely true that homeownership is perhaps the mechanism by which we begin addressing with these racial wealth gaps. And here's the but. I think even more important than addressing that is getting children of color into high opportunity environments where investments in human capital and social capital will allow them to have economic and social mobility as young adults. And so as between the two options of getting a low income, let's say child of color, into a high opportunity area that has an apartment, or not having them move there at all, I would prefer the former to the latter. Because that, even more than their parents accumulating wealth through property ownership, is going to propel them into a better set of outcomes as an adult. So I'm not a policymaker. I don't have to make that choice. But I think actually that's the priority. Secondary should be helping those families build wealth. But the most important priority is the long-term goal of helping those kids and basically doing human capital investments in those children.
Thank you. Director Kozlowski, did you come back to your question?
Yeah, thank you very much. So I had similar questions about, sort of the how do you solve the underlying wealth issue, and how do you distinguish cause from, sort of corollary. But let me ask a discrete question. Does your finding make an argument for zoning classifications to be specifically temporal? and have an expiration date effectively, so that somebody moving to a place knows that for some certain period of time, their house lot that they purchased is going to be zoned R1, but there will be a date in the future when the highest and best use of that land may be something else, and it will expire and it will become multifamily or other things like that. And then the second question that I have is just, I lived in the Detroit area for a good long time. So I am intimately familiar with how that place has, ebbed and flowed with history. And my question is California, anywhere in California, actually a good model for national zoning issues for metropolitan areas? Because in effect, we have raised the expectations on every front for what an excellent community is in terms of the school facilities, the park amenities, the quality of construction, the sensitivity to environmental issues, and all manner of things that ultimately add cost to development, that we have
Solar
stifled
panels.
development in that way and choked
Yeah.
it off, rather than looking at some place like Detroit, which doesn't have quite the same sorts of restrictions. So I think you probably need to level set California being, as a state, a rich suburb compared to most of the world. So just FYI.
Well, those are a lot of interesting comments and questions. Let me try and break them down and remember them all. So
Sure.
the first is in terms of what sort of policy recommendations in terms of land use does our study suggest? I'm going to get to that. The second was about sunset provisions. I just want to say, there's a general policy matter, I actually really like sunset provisions. I think it's too bad that we don't enact, a local or state government does not enact enough laws that have sunset provisions that have it, because we need to reevaluate policies on a community basis. I think it's a good policy approach. And then the third point is about California as a state versus the rest of the nation. Where should I start? So what exactly are the policy implications of our study? Let me start by saying that our study does not suggest that single-family homes are a problem. Rather, what it suggests is that single-family zoning is a problem. And so in a mixed commercial zone, or in a multifamily, or let's say other residential zone, you could have single-family homes. There's nothing that bars single-family homes in these other zones per se. What I think our study suggests is the simple conclusion that single-family zoning as a form of zoning is excessive in California. And again, we're going to expand the Bay Area study statewide, but it's just excessive in the sense that there is.
Stephen, I'm inclined to agree with you on that particular point. The larger comment or question that I have related to that, though, is that if the cost of developing any sort of dwelling unit is the same, the incentives for developers to build multifamily are difficult to rationalize. So ultimately, you got to have two things. You got to have a zoning modification to allow for denser development of one sort or another. And you also have to lessen the burden so that the economic prospects of somebody putting capital into a project that is multifamily makes sense.
Yes, this is clearly very complicated, and I'm trying to keep it simple by focusing on one element at a time. So I'm focusing not on the actual, production of development, but I'm just focusing on zoning itself first. So the clear policy implication of the study is that single-family zoning as a zoning ordinance form is overused and excessive, and that cities in the Bay Area, but probably regions in the state, need to loosen up that form of zoning and permit more development types across our region and our state. Now, just loosening up zoning, we know, does not result in more development. The kinds of RENA shows that just because you zone doesn't mean something's built. Things have to pencil out. Now, there's two assumptions that I'll present and make explicit in terms of actually building more affordable housing. The first is the assumption is that there is research to suggest that that denser housing options, not universally, but tend to be more affordable on a per unit basis. So part of it is because just the cost of acquisition of the land is a huge part of the cost of development, right? So if you buy one parcel and you build one unit on it, a single family home, that's going to be more expensive on a per capita basis than if you build 12 units on that same land. Now, it might not be as affordable as we hope, right? You might be turning a $2 million potential home into a $400,000 condo, which is certainly not affordable. It's that's starter home value in the Bay Area. So when it comes to the policy discussion, I think the policy is particularly complicated because policymakers are looking for silver bullets. There are no silver bullets here. We focus on zoning to show the relationship between zoning and racial exclusion, but that doesn't mean, and we go into this in detail in part 5 of our series, it's 10,000 words. I can't convey that here. Just zoning for greater density is not going to produce more affordable developments. You have to, what municipalities typically do is they will pair certain subsidies together to try and make a development pencil out, right? So you can pair, for example, credits that a developer might have, like LIHTC, with federal credits and private grants and foundation money. So there are different ways to kind of make these things come together to pencil out.
We're all intimately familiar with that, but those in and of themselves are barriers also. You've answered my question, I guess, is
okay.
Why I was stopping you. And I am grateful for your presentation. It really is fascinating work, and thank you.
I do want to get to the third question you raised, though, which is that so the only reason I talked about Detroit a couple of times is because it's such an interesting contrast, right? Of this region that boomed and has been in sharp decline in the Bay Area. The Bay Area, I like to think of sort of in the last 30 years as sort of Detroit of the 1940s and 50s, just a booming area, vanguard of the American economy. I do think that there are very sharp differences between California and the rest of the country. But what California has in common with the rest of the country are two key features. The first is persistent and strong racial residential segregation. The country and California look very similar in that regard. The second is excessive, restrictive, and single-family zoning. California and the rest of the country are very similar in that regard. I do not believe and would never want to suggest that simply rolling back the degree of single-family zoning will result in achieving any of the goals that you may have, the 5 goals I listed. But I do believe that it's impossible to achieve any of those goals with so much single-family zoning. So the way that I put it in our report, and when I speak about it with journalists, is that rolling back restrictive zoning is a necessary but not a sufficient condition to solving any of these problems.
Thank you.
Thank you. And let's see, Director Frericks, you have a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks so much, Madam Chair. Appreciate it. Stephen, appreciate so much your presentation this morning. Just a quick question. So first of all, there's a lot obviously packed in into what you presented. A question with regard to another, I think, a point, but also a question. Another issue that there are certainly, at least in the Sacramento region, but there exists in the Bay Area and exists all over California and frankly all over the country, are in many cases are the so in addition to the issues around single family zoning and sort of R1 zoning, there's also frankly a lot of ballot blocks planning going on.
Yes.
Urban growth boundaries.
Yes.
I mean, just here in the region, even in my own county, 3 or 4 of the jurisdictions have some sort of urban growth boundary, or every growth, potential external sort of peripheral growth measure goes to the ballot, that kind of thing. Have you guys looked at that at all?
Yes, I mean, absolutely.
entire separate, sort of hornet's nest, but would appreciate your thoughts on those issues. I think it adds to obviously the sort of severity of the situation.
I'm glad you raised that question. I want to answer in two ways. The first is that the Turner survey. So my very first slide framed the issue, and the the cover slide of the presentation framed it not in terms of zoning, but in terms of land use. I would consider those kind of like regulatory controls, right? Approval processes, all these things as land use controls. You could even talk about Article 34, which requires local approval for affordable housing in California. So that's the first point. The second point is that researchers have studied Houston, Texas. And the reason Houston is an interesting municipal case is because Houston is the only major city in the country that does not actually have zoning. But when you look at Houston, it actually has very similar patterns to the rest of the country. So, there are some people out there who just think we just need to roll back zoning and we'll solve these problems. Houston shows that's not the case. And the reason is because in lieu of zoning, Houston has in place a number of regulatory land use controls that function like zoning. So it has, these sorts of, all these different mechanisms that you're familiar with that produce roughly the same effects. So again, this goes back to the point I just made. Rolling back excessive zoning is a necessary but not a sufficient condition. What we need to do is more generally is roll back these other regulatory controls as well, or we're not going to be able to develop. So our study focused on the study that I presented focused on single family zoning and racial segregation, right, and racial exclusion. But zoning is only one piece of this larger puzzle. And I don't want to suggest that just solving zoning is going to solve all these problems. It will not, right? Because there are these other regulatory controls that are layered onto zoning that produce similar effects. So I think I'm not a policymaker. I don't have to deal with the complexity of it. I can just, tease these apart one piece at a time. But you're absolutely right. These other regulatory controls are perhaps just as important, and perhaps in some contexts may be more important than zoning.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Menendian. I think you've certainly gotten us all thinking. We clearly see that there is not a silver bullet in addressing these issues, but it's, zoning is one piece of the puzzle that we as jurisdictions have really got to grapple with. But I got a number of texts from folks saying this has been really interesting. It has been, and we will continue to have conversations just about housing. And as we talk about housing this next year, what are the things that we can do what other tools, what can we do to try to move the needle forward in providing housing that's more equitable, more for sale product for people to actually build equity into their homes, et cetera. So we just appreciate your time because I think it's been very helpful. And I know we're gonna have a lot more conversations about this. Thank you. And I'm sure that staff could probably get us your presentation, which would be helpful. I think folks would appreciate that. And we did record the meeting, so we are able to sort of share this with some of our colleagues who might be interested in learning about this as well.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I appreciate your time. I appreciate your patience. I know this is a tricky subject, but I appreciate the ability to share my research and thoughts with you. And who do I send my big invoice to? I'm just kidding. So.
Thank you. Thanks for going a little bit longer. I'll appreciate it.